The year 1955 is a very significant year as far as the perspectives of Indian cinema history is concerned, because Pather Pachali was released. And now everybody admits, right from Martin Scorsese via Andre Baja to the Indian film scholars, that it is the moment of epiphany. From this point, modernity got a true launching pad. But how do you define the presence of Satyajit Ray? Before Satyajit Ray, there were cinemas in India, and these cinemas could describe stories and narratives. But with Satyajit Ray, an important difference occurred, that cinema could find its autonomy. That cinema is mainly written with images, not with words, was time and again proved by Satyajit Ray. In Pather Pachali, the Song of the Little Road, Satyajit Ray took the basic material from an established novel called Pather Pachali, written by a very famous Bengali novelist, Bibhutibhushan Bandyopadhyay. But to our utter astonishment, we discovered that he drastically edited the novel and made it a little less than the one-third. And he only chose 5 characters and 2 deaths to geometrically shape the narrative. But his actual operational area was beyond the narrative. He was more interested in landscapes, in ambience, in sounds, and what was more striking, that songs remained absent with Satyajit Ray films, at least in the early period. This is a departure, definitely, and the Westerners generally welcomed it, because in Western perception, which we may call a kind of typical modern situation, songs were not that permitted in society, not that every time you were singing. But in India, unnecessarily, songs were put to influence the audience. Satyajit Ray opposed it, and he said that if you want to understand the movements in cinema, you must understand the locational situations and the real juxtaposition of images that may follow the Western scenario like Mozart and Beethoven. You can have masculine A characters and feminine B characters, that you will have to develop the images, and the images should have an autonomy to speak for themselves. In fact, if you look at Pather Pachali, you would find that in direct contrast to the legacy offered by Bangla cinema and Hindi cinema, he stripped his film from dialogues. It was a half-silent movie. And when he took up the project of Aparajito or Apur Sangsar, we would find it is basically the story of a modern Indian citizen in the making. And throughout his film career, he wanted to look at a modern India different from his 19th century version. It wasn't a continuity question. He looked at the post-colonial situation with his own version. When he took up a novel, say Aparajito, for narration, he didn't care for what Bibhutibhushan wrote actually. Apu landed in a press, but definitely with a purpose. It was entering into Gutenberg galaxy. When he talked about Charulata, it was necessarily not a question of adapting Rabindranath quite religiously. It appeared like a blasphemy in Indian situation. People seriously condemned Ray for deviating from the original Rabindranath narrative. But what Satyajit Ray wanted to prove, that what is called enlightenment or Renaissance in our parlance is a serious misunderstanding of the situation. It put the Dalits, the subaltern and the women community in the background. It was mainly confined to the upper class aristocrats. And that this lady is lonely and her pathetic fallacy is valid. The reason was offered by Satyajit Ray that the Enlightenment couldn't reach indoors. The indoor-outdoor dichotomy is a kind of critique offered by Satyajit Ray. It's a kind of authorism. Before him, in films, actors were important, productions were important. Say in Bangla cinema, New Theatre Studio was very important, and its logo of an elephant became a household image with people. The actors like Pramothesh Barua, Kanan Devi, they were very important. Films were sold and released in the promise that Kanan Devi, Pramothesh Barua would be there, or it is a product from new theatres. But Satyajit Ray created a situation when the film comes from the filmmaker's cerebral cortex. It is designed, it is mastered by the director. Somehow he had something in common with the French Nouvelle Vague, where a good film or a bad film didn't matter. The authorism, the signature of the author became the most important thing. And what is important with Satyajit Ray, the cardinal statement with Satyajit Ray is that he brought a new kind of realism in Indian cinema. His cinemas were not spectacles, although he underwent certain changes. Satyajit Ray in the 50s is not the same in the 70s. If you compare and contrast the Opu trilogy and the urban trilogy of the 70s, say Pratidwandi, The Adversary in 1970, Sinhabadha, The Company Limited in 1973, and Janaranyo, The City in 1974, you would see that Satyajit became a very cruel critic of the situation, and he was hell-bent upon proving that Indian enlightenment apparently had serious shortcomings for which the ambiguities usually occur. His Urdu film, Satranj Ke Khiladi, gives us a beautiful critique of the Indian freedom movement. He neither supported the feudal lord Nawab Wajid Ali Shah because of his decadence, nor came in open support with Lord Dalhousie, who was representing the imperial force. He was in a dilemma. But in general, as son of famous Bengali literature Sukumar Rai and grandson of equally famous Bengali literature Upendra Kishore Rai Chaudhary, he had a notion of progress and development in his blood. He knew that India needs reason and rationality to progress. It is not enough to say that give us back that forest and village, we are content. No, it's not that. Life should move forward, but there are enough scopes of critiquing. And technically, we are fortunate that Satyajit understood the language of film in a very competent manner. We can say we had several modes of lighting, say lighting in the studio is simple lighting using filter, or say expressionist lighting, creating chiaroscuro, darken light. You can use Hollywood light, key light, backlight, fill-in light and background light. But Satyajit and his cameraman Subrata Mitra created a bounce lighting which is known as neorealist lighting right from 1956 Aparajito, where with a believable credential of light presence he could create magic. Like we can refer to the interior of the Kashi house where the Hindu priest used to live in, or in Opu Sangsar, the moment where Soumitra Chattopadhyay, in order to smoke, is lighting from a matchbox, and the light apparently makes the lady protagonist Sharmila's face so transparent and iconic. These are moments to be remembered, and Satyajit's use of sound, particularly of the incidental noise they are very relevant to Indian cinema, but he did not want to prove his point like Godar. He was more in for suggestion. To suggest is to create, to name is to destroy. It was her motto. It was his motto. And in general, he became successful with his cinema. Bearing a few films, his last films, when he was very sick, his films usually edits dialogue and remains with a minimum budget, which suited the Bengali audience. He knew that the Bengali market is limited, and that is why you will have to work within a limited span. He did not take up big ventures, which he himself wrote in his literary outputs. And his was a kind of realism perfectly fitted for Indian scenario. If we now take up another personality, 4 years younger to him, Hrithik Ghatak, we would see a different kind of scenario. Hrithik Ghatak is a kind of explosive situation. He likes to make contrast, and he is more historically conscious. To Satyajit Ray, the real was the substance of cinema. He took up a village, he scanned it, and he offered to us for viewing, say Pather Pachali or Ashoni Sanket. These can act as case studies. But when you take up the case of Hrithik Ghatak, say Ajantrik or The Pathetic Fallacy, one of his most important films, and a film liked by Satyajit Ray very much, he shows apparently a man in tremendous love with its automobile. What did it signify? It signifies a kind of modernist intervention in cinema. India was more accustomed to using bullock carts and slow movements. Now here comes among the tribals a car, and the car operator loves the car like anything. In Hrithik, it is a kind of Marxist influence that motivated him to develop a rhetoric of the working class. Naturally, the card will be used by a person who is not an agricultural laborer. He is a modern worker, and that is why Hrithik wanted to emphasize this kind of affinity for a machine. He also considered the possibility of liberating the machines, and he thought that since machines posed generally a threat to Indian psyche, because machines were basically brought by the Britishers not to improve the country's situation but for their profit. That is why Indians are in general mood to condemn anything by saying mechanical. He offered the counterpoint, the love affair. And inside the story, inside the original literary narrative written by one Subodh Ghosh, he inserted the life pattern of the tribals, the Bairaki. And if you look at his most important films, the Partition Trilogy, Meghe Dhaka Tara, Cloud Capped Star, Komol Gandhar, E flat major, and Subarna Rekha, the Golden Line, you would see that this is the most important document of Indian partition ever created, and he could go beyond the political meaning of the partition. He was not concerned with the effect, political effect and social effect of partition, rather on the trauma developed because of the partition problem. And it is interesting to note that in each film, the central protagonist was a woman, because in his opinion, the women community suffered more. It was Nita in Meghe Dhaka Tara, it was Anusua in Komal Gandhar, and it was Sita in Subarna Rekha who opened their heart and we saw them bleeding. And it is Hrithik's achievement, like Fellini and Buñuel, he could offer a situation where the Hindu culture complex can be invaded. He used the myths only to shatter them, the way Buñuel used the myth of Christ to shatter it in, say, Nazarene or Ashian Adalu. Fellini dethroned Christ in La Dolce Vita. In the same way, Hrithik made a frontal attack, a frontal assault on the tales of Ramayana by saying that it has already become a deplorable Brahminical text. Its meaning should be altered to suit the needs of modernity. And when you take up the cause of camera, Hrithik's camera was far from being realistic. He is a person who could use an extreme long shot with an extreme close-up, apparently a kind of grammatical adventure, and perhaps inviting wrong moments of editing. But he showed such kind of courage and became successful in some cases like Ajantrik. And in sound, he was the first person, I think, along with Jean-Luc Godard in France, who said that sound should be given more prominence in cinema. It is not that sound is a second voice in cinema and pictorials are first. There are situations in Hrithik Ghatak cinemas when sound played the role of the protagonist. Say, when on a railway platform, someone discovers her Dalit mother, hitherto known as a Brahmin, dying. The truth was revealed, and that is why Hrithik Ghatak moved away from the spot. He inserted cacophonies, rather long, to prove that Indian history, the very conception of foundation of life, was trembling. The same way, two ordinary folks, village folk, in love, on their first marriage night, Hrithik showed everything using a brilliant deployment of the soundtrack in Titash Ekti Nodir Naam, basically a film from Bangladesh. Titash is the name of the river, and it was repeated in Jukti Tokko Goppo. His was a discursive cultural practice, so popular with the Nouvelle Vague, and it stands in direct opposition to Satyajit Ray, that taken together, they offer you a complete whole. Cinema gained a kind of dignity and aristocracy with Satyajit Ray and Hrithik Ghatak. In India, we had great literatures, we had great dramas and great paintings, that we were lacking great cinemas. Satyajit and Hrithik arrived and filled up the gaps. We had the moment of Pather Pachali and we had the moments of Subarna Rekha. That is the achievement. And from that point onwards, we understood that the sign language of cinema is different from the sign language of literature. It is not a question of translation, it is a question of creation, and creativity always moves in a direction which remains unknown in the beginning. Always it's a kind of revelation, a kind of arriving at a new land.